Welcome, busy gamers. Today we're going to be talking about Temtem. What's good, what's bad, and that all-important question, is it worth your time? Now, if you've joined me for another worth your time video in the past, feel free to go ahead and skip straight to the section you're more interested in, and if not, we're going to be heading straight into the overview right now. Temtem was released in September of 2022 after spending almost 2 whole years in its pre-release. It refined and made changes for the game. It was developed by Crema Games and it was published by Humble Games, and it's a monster collecting Pokemon clone with some MMORPG or massive multiplayer RPG aspects, and it's out for all of the platforms right now. It focuses on being a bit more of an adult version of its predecessors that has greater levels of strategy and tactics built into the game. In the game, you're going to be taking the role of a young and budding Temtem trainer who, after being paired with one of 3 starting Tems, sets off to make a name for themselves and become the best Temtem trainer in the floating isles of Omninesia. Throughout the game, you're going to be proving your skills by taking on wandering trainers, other players, dojo leaders, and, in a bit of a sinister side story plot, the Belsoto Clan. Each island in Omninesia is unique. It boasts some drastically different environments and some Tems to collect and trainers to battle. In addition to the story of the game, though, there's also competitive multiplayer battle scenes built in, as well as Temtem breeding, player housing, and other myriad social features. Let's move on to the review, and at the time of this review, I've played Temtem for just over 10 hours on PC. I've completed the first major dojo, I've interacted with the majority of the main elements of the game, outside of some post-game content and player housing. So what's good about Temtem? The battle system in this game is really where I think it shines, and honestly, that's not just in one aspect. For me, the key changes can really be summed up into 3 or 4 main points, and I'm going to be covering them here. The stamina system for battles is a standout for me. It creates an actual reason in the game for you not to just spam your best attack over and over and over again. Since your Tems, or small animal-like creatures and monsters that you tame and then use to battle, you can thank Pokemon for the purposes here, but we're going to refer to them as Tems as that's what they're called in the game. They only regenerate a set number of stamina per turn, and this amount of stamina is going to be effectively lower than the amount of stamina used every turn on your more powerful attacks. You can take a turn off for your Tem to restore more stamina, or you can push them extra hard, and one turn you can actually spend their health instead of stamina when you run out. This will of course force them to be exhausted, take a turn off, and it really risks getting them knocked out, either by themselves or by additional damage they're going to take throughout that battle. But desperate times do call for desperate measures, and sometimes it's the appropriate tactic to take. So moves in Temtem also have a priority system, not to be confused with a base speed of a move or a skill. A move's priority represents a number of turns that have to resolve before the skill becomes available to use. This forces you to play the long game in some scenarios versus some of the more traditional glass cannon or all offense style builds that are common in the genre. I also think that random chance and luck is less of a factor in this game. Skills that apply your effects such as poison, sleep, etc. automatically succeed when they're used instead of, like most of these games, being a % chance to hit or resist. They're more just gated beyond the priority of preventing them from being used in the first few turns or the abnormally high amount of stamina they're going to cost. They also apply with a set number of turns or a period they're going to be remaining effective, and they communicate that clearly to all the players involved. Finally, all the battles are almost always 2 versus 2 instead of 1 versus 1, making creating an overwhelming type advantage in a battle a lot more difficult. It's not only players who are going to have full or deeper rosters of Tems to fight with as well. Even early on in the game, you're going to be encountering NPCs that have 4 or more Tems in their party and actually put up a bit more of a fight using their Tems strategically. Now, if everything I've said so far isn't enough to prove to you that this does have a deeper level of strategy, they've also added better mechanisms around player versus player content and dueling. They consider all of these forms to be competitive versus a casual play, and this is also how the Dojo leader battles take place. You're going to be selecting a party of 8 Tems inside your typical 6, and then you're going to be entering a pick and ban phase with your opponent. Your Tems here are also restricted, as you can't just stack up your party with duplicates of a species to ensure that it gets through the ban phase. That's enough for the mechanics here. Let's talk about really quickly a few other goods. I think the art style and the feel here in this game are going to get a positive nod from me, including a little bit of the dialogue. It's not the biggest selling point, but the art manages to retain a more childlike or stylized approach while being filled with some detail and some movement. In addition, where the dialogue really isn't winning any Writers Guild awards, there are definitely moments where it actually stands out or conveys some genuine brevity and some fun. I mention this because while they're a smaller company, at least they're on par with, if not ahead of, the genre's most popular title, Pokemon, in both of those areas, in the aesthetics, in the writing. And so I think that's worth calling out. The world also feels pretty alive to me. I found many of the Monster Collector games to have an awkwardly empty world, and being an MMO does address that with other trainers and their partner monsters running around the map all the time. It's occasionally a little distracting, yes, but by and large it makes the premise seem a lot more viable with other trainers or collectors out there trying to be the best, so to speak. The final thing I want to draw attention to is just how well they've done the help screens. I never had any issue at all getting quick and relevant information on just what an ability or an intrinsic trait or status did. Basically anything at all you needed to play the majority of the game is well spelled out, easy to access, but not at all intrusive. If not, it's covered by a tutorial when it's first introduced mechanically. So what's bad about Temtem? Honestly, it's just a lack of innovation here, and that really frustrated me. I know I discussed a lot about how well the combat worked in Temtem versus its predecessors, and I 100% stand by that assessment, but it feels like the design team revamped and innovated in one area, and then the remaining elements of the game are almost completely copy and pasted from other titles in the genre. When things aren't broke, you shouldn't fix them, but having something be familiar is not the same as having something feel exactly the same. For example, your Tem cards capture and pulse 3 times exactly like a Pokeball. Random encounters in tall grass are exactly the same as the very first experience I had in Pokemon Red and Blue when I was a child. In my opinion, there's just no excuse to borrow that heavily and make that little of a change from games that are over a decade old. So let's move on to the design of Temtems themselves. They definitely had an aesthetic, and I realize this one's going to be personal preference, but for me, they were either only slightly modified animals or they were childish. And I'm looking at FOMO here. I'm fairly sure my 4-year-old has a few stuffed unicorns that particular Tem imitates very well. I'll also mention here that while the MMO portion of the game made the world feel populated, based on your internet connection, your speed, your availability, this could easily be a negative for you. The game does require a constant online presence to run. And the last thing I'll discuss is, before we hop into efficiencies, we can talk about the monetization. I personally found them to be poorly implemented and something I likely would never find value in. That being said, I will note that it's not at all intrusive in any way, so the quibble over this is minor at worst. So on to the channel focus, the ephemeral efficiencies, so to speak. How does Temtem treat your time? I saved this for the efficiency portion of my review versus looking at it beforehand, but Temtem is such a grind. What they make up for in their combat system does unfortunately result in a situation where after most of your battles, your poor little creatures are going to be at 40 to 60% of their maximum health. Rarely are you going to string together more than 2 trainer battles before you're going to want to expend some sort of healing item. And because of this, you're going to be spending a really tiring amount of time running back and forth to the nearest source of free healing, or you're going to be investing all of your in-game currency on constantly purchasing healing items, which is actually relatively expensive, especially early on. I honestly wish they'd made trainer battles more difficult and then just healed your party up to full after a battle. That, along with the fact that unlike other similar games, you're less encouraged to make a single best team from the game, but more rather trade in and out Tems for the situation at hand. You spend way too much time in superfluous battles and grinding out yet another level for yet another Tem, and that becomes even more exacerbated by the fact that there's no experience sharing mechanic for your entire party to get experience, or for knocked out characters to get experience at least early on in the game. Let's move on to our final scores. Overall, I'm going to give this game a 6. It's decent, and it does a lot of things really well that I want to reward and encourage. I hope more games in the genre pick up and expand on the type and style of combat that we see here, but unfortunately it buries everything that makes it special inside the skeleton of a genre that seems to refuse to change. The efficiency score I'm going to give this game is just a 3. This, like I said before, while the game is fun, it just requires time, effort, and work to get that enjoyment out of it for me. And I didn't get into or experience the breeding portion or really work on getting my optimal values on each of my Tems, which requires constant catching and looking for green values and above average and above rate things. So for those of you who have stuck with me for this entire video, thank you so very much. You make this possible and you encourage me to keep doing this kind of content. So if you've liked what I've had to say, if you disagree with me, or if you just have a question or some constructive feedback, feel free to go ahead and leave me a comment and I'll make sure to get back to you. Until next time, enjoy gaming.